Dungeons & Dragons has been around for almost 50 years, and the game that bears the name D&D now is not exactly the game that Gary Gygax created in 1974. There is a movement in the D&D community that is growing, a group of gamers from all ages and all walks of life. They dream of yesteryear and great games of the past. They see merit in what the earlier editions of tabletop role-playing had to offer. The OSR, today on the Old Men Rolling Dice podcast. Old Men Rolling Dice is brought to you by CanadianDice.ca. Don't forget to use the OMRD code at checkout for a 10% discount off your entire order. Hey, it's DM Jeremy. Old Men Rolling Dice is a Dungeons & Dragons podcast where we talk about old school D&D. But what does that really mean? What is old school? And what is the OSR? I sat down with my friend Stuart to see if I could get a definition for you.
Tell us who Stuart Robertson is.
I would say that my name is Stuart Robertson, and in the context of our conversation, I am an RPG writer and illustrator, and I've been playing role-playing games since, I always get this wrong, it was either 1983 or 1984.
I think it was 84. For those of you out there might know Stuart from the OSR logo. The blue logo that floats around.
That blue logo, also that sword OSR logo,
yes,
and a couple of others.
The sort of Conan sword with OSR.
Mm-hmm. I did put it together, and my name is in a few books for including the various OSR logos.
I would say that 2 years ago, I was not a member of the OSR community. I like to think I am now. Not that there's anyone saying who gets to stay and who gets to go, but what is the OSR? Like, old school role playing? I've heard it called old school Renaissance, old school revival.
The actual answer is the OSR was a blog roll on Blogger way back in the blogging days, and it was all the people that wrote about playing TSR era D&D and other older role playing games. They would link to each other, and I have no idea who originally started referring to that collection of bloggers as
that even
the
fits
OSR.
The old school D&D sort of storyline. No one knows where it began.
So some people really wanted to call it the old school Renaissance or the old school revival. I kind of prefer old school role playing because I think the old school Renaissance of what? The old school revival of what? Because taken out of context of being on that blog, the revival of what? Yes. One of the defining sort of characteristics of it was that DIY, it almost sounds pretentious to compare it to punk rock, but it had a lot of those similar, do-it-yourself, punk ethos to it, and that tied in with blogging, right? Like we're going to make our own stuff. We're going to publish our own material. We're going to put our own blogs up. We're going to put our own zines out. We're going to make our own adventures, our own rule sets. So it did have some similarities to things like punk and zine culture. And I think that it was always one of those things that wasn't always defined. And I kind of like that because it let people define it the way they wanted to. And so there was never and people would always make fun when someone started getting up like, I'm the king of the OSR or things like that. And people would joke because there isn't one. There's no leadership to the OSR. There's no, if you said you're not sure if you're in it. If you want to be in it, you're in it. Because it's basically just, it's like saying, I don't know if I'm in zine culture, if I don't know if I'm in punk culture. It's just a subculture a very niche subculture, a subculture of a subculture.
So when do we think this started? I have an idea where I think it started, but when do we think that this sort of need to define ourselves as old school role playing versus the new school of role playing?
I think specifically in regards to this, there was a lot of people who found third edition D&D wasn't what they were used to. It wasn't what they loved about role-playing games in D&D because it was very rules heavy. And because it was created by the folks behind Magic the Gathering, there was a lot of builds, like build your deck. So build your character. And so you're optimizing before play, the way you would with Magic, right? You optimize your deck before you come to play. And that's a big part of the game and the hobby. And so that really wasn't the experience for a lot of people with things like D&D. I mean, the dungeon master would make a map and an adventure and all that stuff, but the players typically wouldn't at home like tweaking things because there wasn't really anything to tweak before you show up for the game. I mean, there was always a bit of rules lawyering, and people would sometimes come up with I got this idea of delayed blast, fireball, and time stop and things like that. So there was always a little bit of that, but certainly with third edition, there was much more focus on the mechanics of the rules, the tactical grid, rules optimization. And so a lot of people were saying, this isn't really what I loved. I kind of like this other way that D&D used to be. And so they wanted to make it clear, hey, when we're saying D&D or we're saying role-playing games, we don't mean what you guys are talking about with the optimizations and the tactical grid and everything. We're talking about this other thing, and we want to differentiate so that when we're talking about it, we're having that conversation instead of having to constantly explain what we mean. I think that it was really about the change in focus of the game. I mean, some people have described it as rulings over rules, you know, and things like that, or player skill as opposed to character skill. This umbrella term for a group of people that all generally liked older 1970s, 1980s, 1990s role-playing games. Not always just D&D, sometimes other games, right?
And we should maybe mention that we're not talking just about D&D here, right? The OSR embraces all games that were sort of
published. Well, to some people, but in the same way that you'll meet a punk who's like, you don't like the Dead Kennedys, you're not punk, right? And so I think if you ask 20 different people who say, hey, I'm part of the OSR, they're going to give you 20 different answers.
Do you get the feeling that Dungeons & Dragons has an enormous variety of players within the community? You know what other D&D thing has a huge variety? Our dice collections. If you want to grow your collection, go to canadiandice.ca and check out their mystery boxes. You get 5 random sets of dice, and they promise no duplicates and lots of variety. Remember to use the code OMRD at checkout for a 10% discount. Now let's see if I can lock Stuart down on an OSR definition. Wish me luck.
So if we're building our own little definition here, so the games that we're talking about, to make a quick addition list, we're talking about what people may refer to as white box original D&D. We're talking about the Holmes, I believe it's Dr. Holmes, the blue edition, the blue box. Then we move into Moldvay BX and the Beckney, the BCMI. We're talking about then Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And for some people, second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. People aren't even playing these games really that are involved in the OSR. A lot of them are running a clone or a cleaned up version of one of those games I just mentioned, from Dungeon Crawl Classics to Old School Essentials to, I guess, Castles and Crusades would technically be an OSR.
Again, so that I'm very open-minded about that definition. So basically, if it's an old game or something that evokes the feel of those old games, I say yeah.
Old school gaming, low fantasy; new school gaming, high fantasy. Do you think that comparison holds any?
I think all these comparisons you're saying are generally what most people would think of the difference between old school gaming and new school gaming. While these are general terms, and I generally agree, a lot of OSR games tend to be gritty, low magic, low fantasy, and newer games tend to be more utopian worlds and high fantasy and high magic. That's not always the case.
I'm just being a bit of a troll trying to get you to lock down on something.
I've been involved in the OSR since the early 2000s, and I've seen so many people argue about what it is and mischaracterize it and say, oh, it's all like this or it's all like that. I guess I'm a little bit I don't know if sensitive is the word, but I want to make sure that it's clear that there's a lot of range there.
Old Men Rolling Dice is brought to you by CanadianDice.ca. Don't forget to use the OMRD code at checkout for a 10% discount off your entire order. It's my hope that you, the listener, have a better idea of what the OSR is now. I would have considered myself a modern gamer until recently. I always picked up the newest version of the game and played the heck out of it. But recently, I feel like Dungeons & Dragons specifically has kind of left me behind. And those feelings are for a number of reasons that maybe we'll address in the future. Stuart and I went on to discuss the OSR zine culture. It's a sort of underground publishing network. And we also addressed the elephant in the room, which is, why does the OSR have a bad rep amongst modern gamers? Suffice to say, it was too much for a single episode, so look for future episodes with our conversation continued. In fact, I invite you to hit the follow button or the subscribe button so that you're alerted to those future episodes from Old Men Rolling Dice. And why not join us on Instagram or Facebook for even more old school content? Until next time, I'm DM Jeremy.